Welcome to the DeLorean Weekend YouTube channel. You might be asking, isn't this the DeLorean Mac Mini podcast? Well, we're rebranding a bit to reflect the DeLorean show we host every year in October in Las Vegas. You can check out more information about our upcoming show at DeLoreanWeekend.com. So without further ado, here is Bob Brandys, DeLorean expert with over 30 years of experience on what goes wrong with your DeLorean as it ages. This was filmed in front of a live audience at the Vegas show earlier this year. We've got 5 or 6 other talks from that show coming out soon. Enjoy, and let us know what you think in the comments below.
Welcome to DeLorean Weekend Podcast. This afternoon's DeLorean Tech lecture is going to be on what happens to your DeLorean as it ages. The main purpose of this tech talk is for those new DeLorean owners, particularly the young ones, who really don't know the history of the car or the history of what has gone wrong with it, and possibly and hopefully what's been fixed in their car that they just bought. So we're going to go over a lot of history and a lot of tech stuff, and hopefully you'll walk away with a lot more understanding of your car. And so where did this start? Everybody dreams of a bar find or what I call a money pit. This is a DeLorean that was out in the woods with a tree growing next to it, covered with a lot of dirt and dust and debris. I've restored 3 cars like this, and you learn a lot. They're a challenge, but as our DeLorean World Tour people said, we're going to buy DeLoreans that no one would bother restoring and then make them into real cars again, and we've done that and made some very, very nice DeLoreans. So, early on, when the cars first came out of the factory, what were the first things that failed? And there was a number of items. There was an initial recall for loose bolts on the front sway bars. Of course, there was the alternators that failed. There was broken muffler brackets, loose trailing arm bolts, power window motors failed, and of course, the illustrious plastic clutch line failure. So what did this look like? This is a picture of the sway bar bolts. This car does not have the factory recall on it. And the factory recall was simply a bunch of tabs that they put below this bolt and bent the tabs up so the bolt wouldn't come loose. So if you don't see tabs holding your bolt on, you probably didn't get the factory recall. Does it really make a lot of difference? No, just make sure your bolts are tight. And on every car I've tightened them up, I've never had them come loose again. This, of course, is the infamous Ducellier Alternator that had a 98% failure rate. That's not an accident. Failure rates on alternators are less than 1 in 1,000, and on new ones they're close to less than 1 in a million. The fact that he had a 98% failure rate, they basically sold him junk. And of course, DeLorean did not pay for these. Here's another shot of the Ducellier alternators. And so what did people do early on? At least from the factory, they started putting in Motorola alternators. But one of the things that bothered me about the design was these brown power wires from the alternators. And this is unusual. Why DeLorean engineers ran all these positive 12-volt wires to the different sections of the car? They just did this. It's sloppy, it's bad engineering, it's a waste of wiring. And the problem, and we'll talk about this later, this stuff starts to corrode. What I do on my cars is I basically replace this with a 6-gauge or an 8-gauge wire to the fuse box, because this is just a lot of stuff that's, the more wires you have, the more that's going to go wrong. So we got rid of that. What people typically do is they replace it with a 105 amp GM alternator today. It's a SI10 model rather than an SI12. So if you're going to do that, buy an alternator. You can get the really cheap ones, eBay, simply looking for an S10, SI10, or you can go to the vendors and pay a little bit more. But in any case, just change the alternator. Most likely your car has had it. I think I have seen 1 car with an original Ducellier alternator on it. And the next initial failure was the broken muffler brackets. They basically all cracked right at this particular point. It was a vibration issue, and if you re-welded them, they didn't break again. So that hints at a hardening problem when they were originally stamped, or there was stress put into here from the original factory. But most of these have been fixed on everybody's cars. I haven't heard of a muffler bracket going bad again, since the late 80s or early 90s. Here's another repair job on it. Trailing arm bolts. Early on, this was a real problem. A lot of stuff fell out. Here's a trailing arm, and the shims are obviously missing, so this was floating in there. If you don't have shims on your trailing arm, there's probably came loose and someone just tightened the bolt and your alignment is off. Here's another trailing arm, no shims on it for the alignment. And this is a trailing arm that got bent because it came loose and it was just dangling around. And if your trailing arm is bent like that, you have to replace it. So make sure your trailing arm bolts stay tight. Here's a typical trailing arm bolt. I said, oh, I'm going to fix my trailing arm. So you try and get your trailing arm bolt out and then go, it ain't coming out. Not without a big crowbar and a big hammer and lots of force. And this is what you'll find when you get them out. They actually bend quite easily. Here's again another one. These are replacement trailing arm bolts that are hardened so they're less likely to bend. But if you're going to put a high horsepower engine, you need to have trailing arm reinforcements put in, and there's a couple vendors who make that. This is a trailing arm replacement kit. Problem I have with some of this stuff, these look like original 35-year-old parts. And these look like original 35-year-old parts. So 35-year-old rubber in a car may not be a good idea. Here's another kit where they give you the shims and the trailing arm bolts. So if you're going to deal with your trailing arm bolts, you may want to look at some newer parts. We'll show that a little bit later. But this is something you got to really pay attention to. And then another early failure was the window motor drive shaft failure. These were plastic and they would crack in this particular place. Mainly what happened is you would hit the end of travel on the window, cause stress in here because these designs did not have current limiters that would sense that the window was closed, and so this stuff would break. And then the other place it would bend is right in here. And this is a close-up of it. See how skinny this groove is? And this is much larger, and what would happen, this would literally drive it out of the shaft and it would be flopping inside your door. So they came up with replacement ones. The other thing that was wrong with these, this is where you get into the question of, did they sell them junk again? These are the non-concentric drive gears in window motors. And the motor would make a funny sound, and go, rrr, rrr, rrr. And the spacing on these gears was not even. How do you screw something like that up? But yeah, a lot of them were non-concentric drive gears. They were defective. These are the aftermarket ones. They basically replaced the spring worm gear drive with a 3/8 inch diameter from a 5/16. And the big thing they did is this tube is much thicker metal now, so it can't actually be damaged by the motor driving the spring worm gear through it. And then of course the infamous plastic clutch hose. As soon as the car warmed up or on a hot day, this plastic thing tube would expand and you'd have no clutch pedal. And virtually all of them now have been replaced with a braided steel line. So if you see a braided steel line on your car, your plastic hose is long gone. And then we started getting medium-term failures. Water pumps would fail, hoses would come loose or crack, the rear louvers would break on them, the angle drives and your speedometer would stop working, and then you started getting into the corrosion issues, and a lot of cars are experiencing problems with that right now. And then of course the people who don't drive their cars get into issues of fuel system contamination, and that's a very, very costly problem. This is a typical water pump on a DeLorean. You can replace this with a Volvo water pump, which is what was going on very early. And the difference is that on the Volvos, the shaft is longer than on a DeLorean. But early on, this was the low-cost fix because you couldn't get DeLorean water pumps. Now you can. And most of the ones that have failed have been replaced. They generally all failed around 30,000 miles. So the odds are your car probably has had its water pump replaced. And then of course hoses, 35-year-old rubber. They now make them out of silicone rubber, which means they'll virtually last indefinitely. And a silicone hose simply doesn't fail. And then of course the broken louvers. They sell repair kits that have bracing that goes down the center with little screws. You just bolt them on and it repairs the louvers. They made those a few years ago and they're still around. And they work. They actually, you end up with a better louver than came out of the factory, because it's not a question of if your louver is going to break, it's only a question of when, because they're all vibrating in the wind as you drive the car. And then of course your angle drives, not a good design concept. These things have a lot of stress on them. John Hervey has come up with supposedly a better design and can handle more stress. But these things, they break. They're driven literally by a nylon plastic disc that's on the outside of your wheel bearing on the driver's front tire. And that nylon disc starts to slip inside because the cables aren't greased. And then one of these usually snaps and then you have no speedometer. And if you don't figure out where your friction point is, you'll replace this and then it'll fail again. Usually the failure point is in the speedometer cable that screws onto the end of this and goes up to your speedometer. The inside was never lubricated properly. The cable wore through and now it's actually grinding on the inside, and that causes friction here, and then these things fail. So if you have one of these things go bad, check the cable going to your speedometer, because it's probably going to need lubricating. The earliest major corrosion problem was related to these door lock cylinders. In some respects, ancient technology. This is a big wire wound magnet in here. It would pull the shaft in or stick it out to unlock and lock your doors. These things weighed 3 or 4 pounds each, and at the end of when they're at the bottom of your door, and they put all kinds of stress on your torsion bars. So what would happen in the Midwest or areas where there was condensation, water would get in here and it would rust. People would get into their cars and lock the doors and drive and then try and get out and it wouldn't unlock. If you have these in your cars, get rid of them. They're junk and they put a lot of stress on your torsion bars. People go, oh, my struts need replacing. And I go, no, they don't. Take this out of your door will be just fine.
Because you don't want to completely lose the power locks feature, you can replace these old heavy door lock solenoids with door lock actuators. These serve the same function of locking and unlocking the doors, but are built with newer modern technology. They use less power, they weigh a lot less, and they bolt essentially into the same holes. You can get these door lock actuators from a number of DeLorean part vendors. The other big problem with the door locks is the door lock control module. The old module from the factory leaked current all the time and was responsible for a lot of dead batteries. You can now get a replacement digital door lock module, which was made with modern circuitry and does not have this current leakage problem. They are designed to plug right into the standard DeLorean wiring harness.
Cooling fans. Couple things happen here. Of course you get corrosion and condensation and bearings dry out. And then when that starts to happen, it starts pulling more amps. And at the same time, these connectors here would get wet and corrode, and that would cause an additional set of amps going in here. So these things started drawing way too many amps, and a lot of times the motor would stop working.
Another corrosion problem had to do with corroded alternator terminals.
We showed earlier all those extra wires at the end. Well, here's what happens, each one corrodes against the other, and now you have all this resistance coming out of your alternator. And when you have lower voltage coming out of the alternator going to all your circuits, lower voltage has to be replaced by more amps, and that generates more heat, and more heat is more corrosion. And here's the source. These are corroded chassis grounds. The DeLorean has a steel chassis, and you have a ground point here, ground point here, ground point here, and here, and here, and here, and here. And these terminals were plated, not with steel because they were plated, so you get galvanic corrosion across this point of the steel frame, and as soon as this gets corroded and starts to develop resistance, now all of a sudden you got another voltage drop in your car and you get a need for more amps to make stuff happen. There's more ones at the other part of the car. What people do or what they recommend is every year you take every one of these loose, clean them, and re-bolt them to your chassis. So when I fix this, I run additional grounding wires, screw grounding stuff to the chassis, run new grounding wires, and then the problems go away. So what happens when you start drawing additional amps? You start melting your fuse boxes. I think this might be a fan fail where it just melted the hell out of that. Here's another fuel box. This I think was the blower motor for the air conditioning. That's history. Yeah, corrosion and electrical things cause real problems in the cars, and you've got to deal with that. The other thing that corroded, the tail light assemblies. These were solder plated over an early printed circuit board, totally open to atmosphere. The sockets for the bulbs were steel. So if you don't want to spend the money to replace the circuit board, this is a new circuit board, what you can do is where this socket goes to the printed circuit board, you can resolder these joints. This is where they corrode and stop working. So you can actually resolder these and clean this stuff up and make them work. Here's the other part that goes bad. This is the plug onto the board, and these things get dirty and corrode and you lose connection and your tail lights stop working. Clean all that stuff with sandpaper and then put grease on them to stop corrosion and put them together.
The gas tank. If your car has been sitting idle or stored for a year or more, you need to clean out your gas tank.
There's a little opening in it that you can stick your hand into. Just get in there with alcohol and just keep cleaning and cleaning. And eventually you get it clean. Whatever you do, don't try and start them. You'll ruin the car. Here's some of the stuff that's in there. That stuff gets into your fuel nozzles, and your fuel nozzles are junk. Kills the fuel pump and the drive gear. And this is all of your components in your fuel system that have to be replaced, from fuel pump and accumulator and fuel filter and the fuel sending unit. They all get damaged from gasoline evaporating in the car. And considering all the components here, you can understand why it's a big job to fix this once it has happened. And then the other thing about cars stored out, particularly in areas where it rains, water would get into the intake manifold, and particularly your spark plugs are down in holes. Water would get in there, corrode the aluminum in the valley of death, and once you corrode that intake manifold, it's mostly junk. You can try and fix it, but there were a number of cars that were stored outside or left outside, and the water got into the valley of death, and that was the end of the intake manifold. Okay, so now we're dealing with long-term failures. Exhaust gaskets, warped fascias, headlight switches, mode switches, steering racks, torsion bars, transmission computers, rubber steering components, lower ball joints, or gas struts. Once you get past that 30 to 50,000 mile, a lot of this stuff starts to go. So this is your exhaust manifolds, and the gaskets failed here. And you can see the darkening around the ports where the gaskets had failed. What typically goes on here, I need new exhaust gaskets, and they go, okay, oops, broke a bolt, broke another one. They were steel studs in the aluminum block, exposed to 500-degree heat. They rust, corrode, they turn into a little tiny piece of metal, and they snap when you take them loose. So if you're going to go through this exercise, most people recommend replacing the exhaust manifold studs with stainless steel studs, and that should basically cure the corrosion problem. Here's another picture of failed gaskets, what they look like. Why did they fail? Yeah, it's an aluminum block, it's a cast iron manifold. Not probably the greatest choice of gasketing materials, because this problem has been recognized since the 60s, and if you put in a high quality Felpro gasket that has different metal and other fibrous materials, you don't have this problem. But I don't think DeLorean got the best gasket materials when he put this stuff together. And of course, warped fascias have been an issue, and we came up with the fix for this back in the mid-90s and published an article in DeLorean World magazine of how to fix this. It's basically putting a piece of metal on the top of the fascia and gluing it on with epoxy, as you see here, and that straightens out the fascia, and with the metal staying in there, they don't warp anymore. And here's another shot of this fix going on. You can do this with the fascia on the car if you pull the headlights out. And it's basically 1/8 inch thick steel or aluminum glued on with good epoxy. Headlight switches, these have been a problem of failure. I'm not convinced that the switch is the problem. I think corrosion in the headlight system and emergency flasher system is what causes these switches to fail. So if your switch has failed, don't just replace the switch. Go clean up your headlight contacts and your emergency flasher contacts and then replace the switch. Because if you just put a different switch in there, it'll probably just fail again. And then the mode switches, these drive vacuum motors, so there's vacuum that goes to this, and what typically happens is the O-rings wear out and you hear a hissing sound. As far as I know, these have not been repro'd yet. There are people who have successfully rebuilt them. It's not an easy job.
There is a rebuild kit for these switches available from DeLorean Motor Company.
Rack and pinion steering. DeLoreans do not have power rack and pinion, it's manual rack and pinion. Generally they work pretty well and don't wear out a lot, but they can. The main problem is a lack of lubrication in the main steering box. A lot of the DeLorean dealers sell replacement parts. It's not a real difficult replacement if you've played with steering stuff before, but be aware that this eventually does wear out and need replacement. Broken torsion bars, there are a number of instances of these. You can pay $750 or more for a replacement bar from a wrecked car, but really smart metallurgists figured out a modern way to produce a torsion bar that has essentially the same characteristics of the factory ones. The factory ones were produced with a cryogenic hardening process that was relatively new in the 80s. It presented steel with some unusual properties, able to twist and not fall apart. Very expensive to do it that way. The gullwing doors are very cool, but you don't do that. You don't do cryogenic hardening anymore. It's just a matter of the alloy steel, and here's a whole run of torsion bars. And once these came out, the price dropped considerably for replacement ones. The famous automatic transmission computers, these of course do eventually fail. They're a rather unsophisticated computer. In this particular case, using the word computer is probably not technically accurate. This is basically a resistor network that changes resistance based upon the throttle position. If you were really good with electronics, you could replace this with an Arduino chip and a few solenoids. The fix in this is a resistor that goes bad. They take them apart, they replace the resistor, and then they sell them for $400. How to fix these is still on the internet. So if your automatic transmission is doing weird things like only driving in second and third or only going into first and second, it's this thing that has gone bad and you need to fix it or replace it. Worn out A-arm and sway bar bushings. If your car is 35 years old and this has not been replaced, they need to be replaced. The DeLorean front end design, which actually came from Lotus, you can't blame him, depended upon the front sway bar to stabilize the lower A-arm. The lower A-arm in these cars are not triangulated. Triangled reinforcement was dependent upon the sway bar. An interesting cost-saving idea, but when the rubber goes bad, that front lower A-arm starts flapping in the wind and you get strange things in your steering. If your bushings have not been replaced, it's a good idea to replace them. Not a very time-consuming task or even a hard task. It's take it all apart, put new bushings on, and put it all back together. But be aware your car probably needs to have this done. This is a kit from one of the vendors. This is from Toby from DeLorean Parts Northwest. These are new rubber components, but I know the 35-year-old stuff's still out there. I would be very careful of where you source these from if you're going to replace them, because you don't want 35-year-old rubber. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about lower ball joint failure. It is becoming an issue. I'm hearing more stories about this. and I am concerned that this is actually defective parts, not just wear and tear or people didn't lubricate their cars. This is the pictures of Andy's car. He's got it propped up on a rock here, and here's his lower A-arm hanging down, and the ball joint broke right into this area. And this is the part that broke. This is the steel shaft. This is a new part. This should never fail at this point. This is a set of new ball joints from a company in England for DeLorean, and you notice that these are self-locking nuts. These are not keyed nuts. So they know something in terms of putting this together. Why did they change this from a keyed nut to a self-locking nut? And they have retaining rings too, which is also kind of interesting. This is a door strut, and the lower part in the back, this is all fiberglass with steel glued to it. After you've opened and closed your doors way too many times, this starts to break. They now sell braces that bolt on here. It's actually a much better design than the original factory one. Not a big fix, but it is happening on more and more cars. So if yours starts to crack, don't get panicky. It's just a new part you have to put on. This is a fun one. These people,
the torsion bar
instead of replacing the door struts, crank the torsion bar. And you keep doing that and doing that, you actually bend the door. You got to replace the struts and make sure you use good ones. Do not increase the torque on your torsion bars because you'll end up with a taco door. And the number one recommendation I make to people is to get rid of those old heavy power door lock cylinders. They add a need for an extra 30 to 50 pounds force on your torsion bars, and you don't need that. Your torsion bars, it's not an issue of if they're going to break. They will eventually break. It's just the fact of steel. They harden over time. If you want them to last longer, decrease the load on the torsion bars. Other things that go wrong, lower A-arms on the DeLorean are open box. They're just stamped metal. There are people who put an extra piece of metal and kind of box in that lower A-arm. It makes them stiffer and less likely to break. They obviously are failing because they now make new solid aluminum ones. You go over a pothole, particularly in the Midwest, the thing bends and it's junk at that point. They do make new solid lower A-arms out of aluminum for about $800 each. Kind of an interesting idea, but still has the same problems of the geometry and relying on the front sway bar to triangulate. So it's a cheaper, I won't say a cheap replacement for a stamped steel part because it's not cheap, but that's what exists if your lower A-arm gets bent. So we recommend putting those new braces on. I think that can really help. Corroded frames, corroded cracked dashes. Cracked dashes are a real problem. They make repro ones. There isn't any easy fix to that, and taking out a dash pad to replace it, not one of my favorite tasks. Worn out seats, they make repro seat covers. They're okay. Failed heat shields. Very early on, the asbestos heat shields failed. Most of that's been taken care of.
This presentation was put together to help both existing and new DeLorean owners judge the condition of their car. It's also designed to help people who might be considering purchasing a DeLorean in the future to assess the condition of the car they're looking at. Look forward to more information about taking care of your DeLorean from DeLorean Weekend in the future.
Thanks for watching. Click here to subscribe, here to watch more from us, and let us know in the comments what you think. See you next time.